"You've got to be joking," the young officer muttered, stepping out of the patrol car, sunglasses gleaming with arrogance. Franklin Boone, 82 years old, still astride his weathered Harley, hands, steady eyes fixed on the horizon, like he was waiting for something only he could sense. License and registration, off the bike. "Now, sir." She kept her hand near her weapon, mistaking silence for confusion. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that down the road, 12 military Humvees surged in, kicking up dust like a desert storm. 50 soldiers stepped out in unison, and from the lead vehicle, a man in uniform walked forward, saluted, and said just 6 words that made the entire town hold its breath. Who dared to stop Colonel Boone? 82-year-old Franklin Boone lived the kind of life most people overlooked, and that's exactly how he preferred it. Nestled just outside Billings, Montana, his modest farm sat on 40 acres of sun-baked earth, lined with weathered fence posts and golden fields that danced in the wind like soldiers in formation. There were no grand signs, no flashy pickups parked out front, just an old barn, a rusted mailbox that read Boone, and a man whose silence held decades of stories. To most folks in town, Franklin was just the quiet man with the hay bales. He sold to a few local ranchers, always fair with his pricing, always on time. If you passed him on the road, you might catch a glimpse of his signature black helmet atop a vintage Harley, rumbling into the distance. He didn't wave often, but when he did, it felt deliberate, as if it meant something more than hello. What people didn't see were the mornings. Every day without fail, Franklin rose at 5:00 a.m., not because he had to, but because discipline still lived in his bones like muscle memory. He'd stretch, then drop to the wooden floorboards of his bedroom and do 30 push-ups, slow and steady, as if he were still in boot camp. After that, he'd pull open the curtains, breathe in the crisp Montana air, and start the coffee while the sun peeled over the distant hills. His home was simple, 2 bedrooms, one of which he never used. That room remained untouched since his wife Della passed away 20 years earlier. A photo of her still sat on the windowsill facing east, always catching the morning light. By 6:30, he was already outside working on the equipment most men his age would have long given up on. His John Deere tractor, 1978 model green, chipped from time and use, still ran because Franklin knew every bolt and belt like an old comrade. On slower days, he'd spend hours tuning up the Harley, a 1970 shovelhead that looked more like a war relic than a road machine. Most wouldn't ride something that old, but to Franklin, it was part of him. He'd rebuilt the engine himself in 1993, piece by piece. It wasn't about comfort, it was about purpose. Neighbors sometimes asked why he didn't retire or travel or spend his final years relaxing. Franklin never offered a long explanation. "Idle hands forget how to be useful," he'd say, usually with a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He didn't own a smartphone, didn't care for Wi-Fi. He read newspapers, folded them neatly, and still wrote checks at the hardware store. There were no medals displayed in his house, no frame commendations, just boots by the door, a folded flag in a box, and a man who carried his past the way he carried everything else, with quiet dignity and worn leather gloves. And every day when he mounted that Harley to go into town, Franklin Boone looked like just another old man on an old machine, until someone dared to stop him. Officer Dana Kelso was 29 years old and had something to prove, not to the world, but to herself. Raised in a family where rules weren't just guidelines, but lifelines, Dana had grown up believing in structure, clarity, and consequence. Her father had been a corrections officer in Denver for over 20 years, and she'd watched him march through life with his spine straight and jaw tight, believing that the line between right and wrong should never blur, and if it did, it was your duty to sharpen it again. When she joined the police force, Dana didn't see it as a job. It was a mission. She was determined to become the kind of officer who was respected not because she was feared, but because she did things by the book every time. She believed that order kept communities safe, that procedures existed for a reason. Gray areas made her uncomfortable. That belief system worked well enough during her time in Denver, in a department overloaded with chaos, short-staffed shifts, and call after call of urban disorder. But the job there had taken something from her, too. There were cases that haunted her, things she'd seen that no academy training could prepare her for. After 5 years of chasing emergencies, she requested a transfer to the quiet, open landscapes of Montana, thinking perhaps the small-town department outside Billings would give her a chance to breathe and maybe even rise. It didn't take long for her to become known as by-the-book Kelso. She wore her uniform crisp, polished her boots weekly, and never let a citation go undocumented. Her reports were pristine, her paperwork flawless. But what she had in discipline, she sometimes lacked in empathy. She didn't mean to come off cold, she just didn't believe that emotions should interfere with duty. Her new partner, Officer Trey Daniels, was her opposite in many ways. At 34, Trey was relaxed, a little too casual for Dana's taste, but undeniably effective. He had the kind of easy charm that made people open up to him, even when they were guilty. Trey had grown up in nearby Billings and knew every backroad diner owner and high school nickname in the area. He'd been with the department for almost a decade and had seen things Dana hadn't yet faced: the slow-burn conflicts, the local grudges, the unspoken alliances that often govern small towns more than laws ever could. Still, he deferred to Dana in the field. She had the drive. She had the command presence. She didn't miss details and she didn't hesitate. He respected that, even if he thought she could use a little more instinct and a little less policy. Dana, for her part, respected Trey too, but she also believed that soft edges led to mistakes, and mistakes got people hurt. In her mind, rules were armor. So when she saw an old man on a rusted Harley sitting too still at a red light, just a little too long, her instincts didn't tell her to pause. They told her to act. What she didn't realize was that sometimes stillness doesn't mean confusion. Sometimes it's the calm before a lesson that would shake the very foundation of what you thought you knew. The low rumble of Franklin Boone's vintage Harley echoed down Main Street like thunder rolling through an otherwise quiet valley. It wasn't a fast bike anymore, age and time had seen to that, but it was dependable, reliable, like him. He rolled to a stop just outside of Marty's Corner. Stop, an old gas station that had served the town since the late 60s. The place hadn't changed much since then. Same hand-painted signs, same buzzing soda fridge, same red bench out front where locals shared coffee and stories most mornings. The air smelled faintly of diesel, sun-baked pavement, and brewing coffee. Franklin eased the Harley onto its stand, his hands steady his breath. Calm. He didn't take off his helmet, not yet. He was just going to top off the tank and head on his way. The fields needed him back before the sun got too high. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The distinct screech of tires against gravel broke the stillness. A black and white patrol cruiser pulled into the station lot with more force than necessary. From inside stepped Officer Dana Kelso, mirrored sunglasses hiding her expression, though her jaw was already set firm. Behind her, Officer Trey Daniels emerged more slowly, adjusting his duty belt, surveying the scene without a word. Dana moved first. "Sir," she called out as she approached, her voice, clipped and professional. "Can you shut that engine off, please?" Franklin turned slowly, glancing at her through the reflection in his side mirror. Then, without a word, he flipped the switch. The engine quieted, but the tension thickened. "You mind telling me where you're headed this morning?" Dana asked, stepping closer. "And can I see your license and registration?" Franklin reached into his worn leather jacket, pulled out a weathered wallet, and handed over the documents without protest. His face remained calm. No fear, no indignation, just that same unreadable stillness. Dana scanned the license. 82 years old, she murmured, just loud enough for her partner to hear. "Sir, don't you think it's a little dangerous for someone your age to be riding a machine like this?" Franklin said nothing. Trey shifted his weight but didn't intervene. Dana went on, gesturing toward the Harley. "This bike doesn't exactly look road safe either. When was the last time it was inspected?" Still, Franklin remained silent. He didn't flinch, didn't argue. His hands rested gently on his knees. His eyes looked not at her, but beyond her, toward the open road. Across the lot behind the station's dusty windows, Marty Ellison froze mid-pour of coffee. A Desert Storm veteran with a limp and a steel rod in his right leg, Marty had run the station for nearly 2 decades. He knew bikes, he knew veterans, and he knew Franklin Boone. He leaned closer, to the glass eyes narrowing. He hadn't seen Franklin stop like this before, not by anyone. Marty's instincts kicked in. He reached for the landline behind the counter, the same one that hadn't rung in 3 years, and dialed a number only a few locals even knew: the operations desk at Camp Sheridan, the nearest Army base 30 miles west. "This is Marty Ellison out at the corner stop," he said when someone answered. "I don't mean to raise alarm, but you might want to check your roster. There's an elderly man being questioned by two local officers. His name's Franklin Boone." There was a pause, static crackled. Then came the question, sharp and immediate. "Did you say Colonel Boone?" Marty nodded, though no one could see it. "Yes, sir. That's the one. Don't let anything happen to him. We're mobilizing now." Marty hung up without another word. He turned back to the window, eyes locked on Franklin Boone. The old man hadn't moved an inch, but things were about to. Back at the gas station, the Montana morning was deceptively quiet. A few birds called out from the telephone wires. A tractor passed slowly on a side road. Nothing about the moment felt like a crisis unless you looked into the face of Marty Ellison, still staring through the window like a soldier bracing for incoming fire. Inside the glass booth of the convenience store, Marty stood rigid, the phone still warm in his calloused hand. His heart pounded in a way it hadn't since Kuwait. He wasn't the panicking type, but something about the officer's voice on the other end, sharp, almost alarmed, told him this situation was no longer small-town police business. 30 miles away inside the control room at Camp Sheridan, Sergeant Major Lisa Grant hung up the secure line and moved faster than anyone had seen her move in years. She turned toward a junior officer and barked, "Get Captain Graves. Tell him it's Boone. Colonel Franklin Boone. Situation unfolding now, send transport and security." Yes, Sergeant," the young man stammered, bolting from the room. Grant sat down, exhaled sharply, and whispered, "Of all people, Boone." She remembered him well. Everyone did. Not because he craved attention, but because he had that rare command presence that made even generals stand up straighter. The man didn't need to shout. He just looked at you, and you wanted to do better. Most of the officers walking those halls had trained under him, and if the locals were hassling him in public, that wasn't going to end quietly. Back at Marty's corner, stop, the dynamic outside the gas station had started to shift, if only subtly. Officer Dana Kelso handed the license back, her tone still firm. "Sir, I asked you a question. Are you headed somewhere in particular today?" Franklin Boone finally looked at her. His eyes didn't challenge, didn't plead, but there was weight in them. The kind of weight that comes from decades of service, of watching wars start and end, of watching people forget what it cost. "I'm going to get fuel," he said flatly. "That's not what I meant," Dana replied, clearly irritated at what she interpreted as defiance. Her partner, Officer Trey Daniels, glanced toward the gas station and noticed Marty had disappeared from the window. He felt something tightening in the air, like the pause before thunder. Dana continued, "We may need to take you in for a wellness check, sir. Your responses are delayed, and frankly, this motorcycle doesn't look roadworthy." Franklin didn't flinch. "It runs just fine." Trey finally stepped in. "Dana, maybe." She raised a hand to quiet him. "I've got this." But she didn't. A faint vibration hummed under their feet, barely noticeable at first. Then came the low, growing roar. Tires on dirt. Engines tuned for war. Dana turned toward the sound, her brows furrowed. Dust curled on the horizon, and from the curve of the road came the unmistakable shape of military Humvees. Not one or two, but a full convoy. 12 in all, moving fast. Each vehicle bore the insignia of the U.S. Army. Uniformed soldiers rode, shotgun faces locked forward. The lead Humvee had a flag fluttering in the wind. The convoy didn't slow down until it was right outside the station, then came to a synchronized, thunderous halt. Dana instinctively reached for her sidearm. Franklin Boone didn't move. Marty stepped outside at that moment, wiping his hands on a rag, watching the soldiers pour out of the vehicles with mechanical precision. One man stepped out from the lead vehicle, tall, gray-haired, still carrying the posture of a warrior. He walked forward with purpose, eyes fixed on Franklin, then turned to face the officers. Then he saluted and said, "Who dared to stop Colonel Boone?" The words cut through the air like a blade. Who dared to stop Colonel Boone? Silence followed. Heavy, deafening silence. Officer Dana Kelso froze her fingers, brushing the edge of her holstered weapon. Not out of aggression, but instinct. She had never heard a greeting wrapped in such forceful respect. She turned slowly toward the voice. The man who had spoken stood tall in his dress, greens, ribbons, and medals lining his chest like chapters in a war story. His face was carved with years of fieldwork and command decisions, but his posture remained sharp spine, straight chin, lifted boots, grounded. He stepped forward and saluted again this time, not to the officers, but to Franklin Boone, who still sat on his old Harley like a mountain untouched by the storm. "Colonel Boone," the man said again, softer now. "Sir, we came as fast as we could." Boone gave the faintest nod, not as greeting, but acknowledgement. A soldier's nod. The kind that speaks across decades without needing explanation. Behind the captain, the remaining soldiers had already stepped out of the Humvees and stood in tight formation, 50 in total. Their movements were crisp, synchronized, not for show, but because that's how Boone had trained them. A full show of force, not against a threat, but in defense of a man they owed everything to. The captain turned his gaze toward Dana and Trey. "I'm Captain Nolan Graves, U.S. Army, who issued the order to stop this man." Dana stepped forward, trying to recover her bearings. Her voice faltered but held firm. "Officer Dana Kelso, local patrol. We stopped him due to concerns for his safety and the roadworthiness of his vehicle." Captain Graves didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority was in his presence. "Did he break any laws?" "No, sir," she admitted, tightening her grip on her citation pad. "But did he resist, threaten, fail to comply?" Dana hesitated. "He didn't speak at first. He was uncooperative." Graves stepped closer. The other soldiers took a step too, not out of aggression, but unity, a silent wall of loyalty. "This man," Graves said, "served in 3 wars: Vietnam, Desert Storm, Afghanistan. He trained generations of soldiers, including me. He has 2 Silver Stars, a Distinguished Service Cross, and more battlefield commendations than this entire town's precinct combined." He paused, his voice tightening with emotion. "He doesn't talk much because he's seen more than most of us could stomach. He doesn't react quickly because he learned long ago that reacting quickly gets men killed. In that motorcycle you mocked, he rode that same machine through the streets of Saigon the day they pulled the last units out. That bike isn't rust, it's history." Dana's face turned pale. She glanced at Boone, who remained perfectly still, dignified even now. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "No," Graves replied. "You didn't. But maybe you should have asked before assuming." A few townspeople who had gathered on the sidewalk were now recording on their phones, but this time not for mockery, for reverence. Boone slowly swung his leg off the Harley and stood. He didn't speak, didn't gloat. He simply looked at Dana and said, "Respect isn't a uniform. It's how you carry yourself." It wasn't reprimand, it was lesson. Graves turned back to Boone. "Sir, would you like an escort back home?" Boone shook his head. "I think the lesson's loud enough." And with that, he mounted, the Harley turned the key, and the engine roared back to life, steady and full, like a drumbeat from the past. The 50 soldiers parted to form a path, standing at attention, as Colonel Boone rode forward, leaving the dust and the lesson behind. Long after the roar of the Harley faded into the horizon, the silence lingered like fog. Officer Dana Kelso stood rooted, unsure whether it was the dust or the shame that stung her eyes. Around her, the soldiers slowly returned to formation, but the emotional weight of what had just transpired hung heavy in the air. Captain Nolan Graves didn't return to his vehicle right away. Instead, he turned to the small group of townspeople who had gathered along the curb, a handful of onlookers who moments ago had thought they were witnessing an old man get reprimanded. Now they stood in the presence of something they hadn't expected: living history. "I know you're all wondering who he is," Graves said, looking not at the cameras but at the eyes behind them. "So let me tell you." He paused, as if deciding how much of Boone's story he could say without breaking the man's code of silence. "Colonel Franklin Boone is one of the last men alive to have served in 3 major U.S. conflicts: Vietnam, Desert Storm, and Afghanistan. But more than that, he was what we call a quiet commander. He didn't scream, he didn't threaten, and he didn't seek the spotlight. But when Colonel Boone walked into a room, you stood straighter. You listened harder. You knew you were in the presence of someone who had led men through fire and brought them back alive." Trey Daniels, standing beside Dana, lowered his head. Graves continued, his voice firm but respectful. He was one of the first special operations trainers at Fort Bragg. Over his career, he personally mentored over 300 officers, many of whom now wear stars on their shoulders. He's been wounded twice in combat, refused medical retirement, refused medals too. Said they belonged to the ones who didn't come back. A soft murmur passed through the crowd. He's the reason I joined, Graves added quietly. When I was a young recruit, raw, arrogant, he didn't tear me down. He made me believe I could be better. And he did that for hundreds, maybe thousands of us. Someone in the crowd, a teenager no older than 17, raised their hand and asked, "Why doesn't anyone know him? Why isn't his name in history books?" Graves gave a sad smile. Because he didn't want it to be. Dana swallowed hard. The truth of it landed like a stone in her chest. She'd stopped him for being quiet, for being old, for riding a motorcycle that looked too rusty for her standards. And yet every inch of that man was forged in duty and discipline, the kind she could only read about in textbooks. Captain Graves looked directly at her now. "Officer Kelso," he said, his voice no longer confrontational but instructive. "You didn't do anything malicious. You followed protocol. But protocol doesn't always recognize valor when it's dressed in denim and leather. That's why we need to do better. Not just follow the rules, but understand the people behind the faces." Dana nodded. "I understand, sir. I was wrong." Graves turned to the rest of the soldiers and gave a single nod. One by one, they climbed back into the Humvee's engines, starting with mechanical precision. But the crowd didn't leave. Something had shifted, not just in their view of Franklin Boone, but in the way they looked at men like him. Men who lived quietly, bore scars in silence, and never asked to be honored, only understood. And from that moment on, in that small Montana town, Colonel Boone's name would never again be forgotten. By the time the last Humvee disappeared down the road, the town had already begun to buzz. Footage from cell phones made its way onto Facebook within minutes. Colonel Boone was trending locally by nightfall, and within 24 hours, regional outlets had picked up the story, "Veteran mistaken for vagrant, saluted by military convoy." Inside the Billings County Sheriff's Department, phones rang nonstop. Complaints, praise, demands for explanation. But the call that mattered most came just after 8:00 a.m. the following day from the command center at Camp Sheridan. Sheriff Les McAdams, a broad-shouldered, even-keeled man in his 50s, answered it himself. He'd been in uniform for nearly 3 decades and had weathered everything from winter blizzards to political pressure. But nothing quite like this. "Sheriff McAdams, this is Captain Nolan Graves. We need to talk not about punishment, but partnership." The conversation was brief, but it carried weight. Graves didn't threaten lawsuits. Boone wasn't pressing charges. But the message was crystal clear: this couldn't happen again. Not in their town. Not to their veterans. By noon, McAdams had called an emergency department meeting. In the precinct's break room, every officer sat in a folding chair, coffee cups untouched. At the front stood Sheriff McAdams with Officer Dana Kelso, seated beside him, eyes down, uniform perfectly pressed. The room was quiet, not out of fear, but out of reflection. "I'm not here to scold anyone," McAdams began, "but I'm also not here to pretend yesterday was acceptable. We made a mistake, a big one. A man who has given his life not just once, but again and again, was treated like a problem instead of a person." He turned to Dana. "She's agreed to speak first." Dana rose slowly. Her voice was steady, but her eyes showed the weight she carried now. "I stopped a man because he was old, because his bike looked unsafe, because he didn't answer quickly," she said. "I thought I was protecting him and the community. But the truth is, I never gave him the chance to show who he really was. I made assumptions." She looked around the room. Some officers nodded. Others stared at the floor. "I didn't just stop a veteran. I stopped a living example of everything we're supposed to protect." She paused, then added quietly, "I've already apologized to Colonel Boone in person, but I want to do more." McAdams stepped forward again. "As of today, we're launching a new protocol. We'll be working directly with Camp Sheridan to train our entire department, not just on recognizing military service, but on how to approach with respect and listen before acting." It wasn't just lip service. The next week, all officers, rookies, and veterans alike stepped onto the training grounds of Camp Sheridan for immersive sessions on veteran culture, trauma-informed interaction, and field etiquette. Dana returned each day not just as a participant, but as a volunteer. She asked questions, listened more, understood the difference between silence and defiance, between stillness and resistance. And it wasn't long before the department culture began to shift. They started asking for stories instead of IDs, asking where someone had served instead of assuming they'd lost their way. Not every encounter was perfect, but the posture changed. The tone changed. Respect wasn't a box to check anymore. It became instinct. And for Dana Kelso, that change wasn't just professional, it was personal. Because once you've looked a man like Colonel Franklin Boone in the eye and seen the wars behind them, you never see a stranger on a motorcycle again. You see a story you haven't heard yet. It had been nearly a week since the incident at Marty's gas station. The headlines had faded, the phones had stopped ringing, and life in the quiet corners of Montana had returned mostly to normal. But Officer Dana Kelso hadn't forgotten. She had gone through the training at Camp Sheridan. She had stood in front of her colleagues and admitted her mistake. But deep down, she knew there was one final step she had to take, not for protocol, not for appearances, but for herself. She had to face Colonel Franklin Boone not as an officer, but as a human being. It was a cool, windless morning when Dana turned off the main road and followed a gravel driveway, flanked by open fields and grazing cattle. At the end of the long lane sat a modest white farmhouse with a rusted tin roof, a small barn off to the side, and a wind chime that danced in the still air like it remembered the breeze. Boone's Harley sat beneath a large cottonwood tree half in shadow, the chrome catching soft hints of the morning sun. A green John Deere tractor stood parked near the barn, mid-repair, its hood propped open like a jaw frozen mid-conversation. She parked her cruiser by the fence, took a breath, and stepped out. He saw her before she spoke. Franklin Boone stood in coveralls beside the tractor, grease on his hands, sleeves rolled. He didn't flinch or frown. He simply straightened up and waited. "Colonel Boone," she said, walking slowly across the dirt. "May I speak with you?" He wiped his hands on a faded rag, gave a nod, and motioned toward the porch. "Coffee's fresh," he said. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and strong black coffee. The furniture was simple, worn but clean. A folded American flag sat on a shelf beside a photo of a woman who smiled like she once knew the sound of his laughter. They sat at a wooden kitchen table, two mismatched mugs between them. Dana tried to begin. He didn't rush her. "I just wanted to say thank you. And I'm sorry, I didn't see you for who you were." Boone looked out the window at the field. "You saw what most people see," he said quietly. "An old man with a machine that doesn't shine. You were taught to look for threat. That's not your fault." Dana hesitated. "But I judged you." He met her eyes. "And then you learned. That's what matters." She sat in silence, letting the warmth of the coffee settle. "Can I ask," she said softly, "why you never told anyone who you were?" He smiled, not with pride, but something gentler. "Because what I did isn't who I am. And respect, that's not something you wear. It's something you give." And with that, the lesson was over. Not with medals, but with mercy. Colonel Franklin Boone never asked for recognition. He never sought attention or reward. Yet somehow the quietest man in the room became the loudest reminder of what dignity truly looks like. In the weeks following the incident, people in town began to see things differently. An old man crossing the street wasn't in the way he might be someone who once cleared paths for others. A weathered leather jacket wasn't just a sign of age, it might be a piece of history. Dana Kelso continued her service, but not as the same officer. She began asking questions instead of issuing commands, listening before reacting. And every time she passed a veteran, something in her posture shifted, not out of guilt, but understanding. As for Colonel Boone, life on the farm went on. The Harley still rumbled each morning. The tractor still needed fixing. He still rose at dawn, still drank his coffee black. But something had changed, not in him, but in those who now waved when he passed. Not with pity, with respect. And perhaps that's the true lesson. Not every hero is on a battlefield. Sometimes they're on a porch, or at a stoplight, or astride a bike older than the officer who stops them. Because service doesn't end when the war's over. So here's a question for you. Have you ever misjudged someone only to later discover they carried a story that changed your heart? Or have you ever met someone, a neighbor, a janitor, a stranger, who turned out to be more heroic than you imagined? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes in dignity, humility, and honor. Thank you for spending time with us and for remembering that sometimes the quietest voices carry the greatest truths.